So welcome to the lecture on Module 10. We finally have a shorter lecture. This is part 2 of quantitative and survey studies, and it's really heavily focused on the quantitative part. We're going to be looking at part of Chapter 8 in our textbook Curious, just the first. You'll see that it's 7 different ways to stay curious. We're just looking at way 1 through 5. Then we're looking at some Canvas materials, quantitative data analysis review, univariate analysis, bivariate analysis, mean, median, and mode. These are all really short sections. You then have a quiz, and then really probably the easiest assignment is actually to take the survey from all of your classmates. So Module 10 is a pretty simple module. I like this module because it's a little bit lighter and it's right around midterms or a little bit past midterms. But so this should be a lighter module for you to do. Our reading from this week is in our textbook Curious is Chapter 8, 7 Ways to Stay Curious. We're not reading all of Chapter 8. We're just reading the first 5 ways to stay curious. Specifically, the first way that he talks about, he labels it stay foolish, and really it's kind of a he's really saying to stay curious, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense when you're talking about ways to stay curious is to actually stay curious. But most of the example in what he's talking about in this first way is about how that when people are curious, they can often discover new things, new businesses, new ideas, ways that change our world, whether it changes our culture or a product landscape, etc. And that once you've been successful at that, that it is that we start relying more on our past success instead of keeping ourselves open and open to new ideas and curious to what's happening around us. He even says something of the nature that success, how does he say it? Success is no friend to curiosity, or isn't good for curiosity. That in curiosity, the balance between exploration and exploitation becomes too far skewed towards exploitation. And he uses Disney in here, and he uses Steve Jobs and Apple to talk about this, that the way that you stay curious is staying on the edge, staying foolish about what you know, that not thinking you have it all, etc. The second idea builds upon something that we saw in previous chapters about building the database, that that you need to have a broad sense of knowledge, and that curiosity actually builds upon having knowledge than just not knowing anything about something. If you remember from earlier chapters, the very first chapters, that learning a fact about something that you know nothing about may make you a little bit curious, but only discursively or diversively so. That you won't go to that deeper level of knowledge because it may seem too overwhelming to begin that. That you have to have some level of knowledge in order to really kind of to be curious to the max and do the epistemic curiosity. And here he's talking about the idea that creativity and curiosity work better if you have a broad sense of knowledge, while also potentially having some deeper knowledge in maybe one or more areas. He uses advertising about this curiosity about life in all its aspects, I think, is the secrets of great creative people. New knowledge is assimilated better and has more creative possibility the bigger the store of existing knowledge it is joining. What else do we have in here? He talks about Sherlock Holmes in the middle of he talks about this idea that if you have a problem, you put it all into your brain, and then you do something very different and allow your subconscious to work behind the scenes. He talks about once Sherlock Holmes had gathered a lot of the facts, he would go to a concert and allow kind of he would take his attention away from whatever he was working on, so that in the background his mind could be kind of putting together links from his database of knowledge that he might not necessarily logically put together. It's quite interesting. And this kind of builds into the next idea, forage like a foxhog. And this, you see a little foxhog there, a hedgehog with the face of a fox. And this is kind of, so we've got, stay foolish, trying to always not overestimate your past success, build the database, having a breadth of knowledge, and forage like a foxhog. And this is based upon an old fable about the fox and the hedgehog. And the idea here is that, the story goes that the fox has many ways to protect itself because it's got many tricks, and a hedgehog has only one, but it's really effective, which is to go into a ball and has all of those sharp little spears. And that in today's day and age, or maybe throughout time, if you could combine those things, if you had a breadth of knowledge, then you might see connections between things where other people would not see connections. I know that when I used to work at EDS, Electronic Data Systems, I was part of a strategic planning exercise that was going over 3 years and trying to engage like 20% of the population of the company into thinking about the future of technology and how things were merging. And this is well before smartphones. This was, that communications and computing was, was going to come together. And that wasn't such a big idea. I remember even, when I was in elementary school 40 years ago, watching, these cartoons of the future of telephones where they had video phones. And that was far away, but they knew that this was coming. But here we're on the cusp of it, and businesses are trying to figure out how these things are going to interlock. And so the idea that if you have a breadth of knowledge as well as some kind of expertise, then you might be able to see connectors between things. It gives a great example of Darwin here, where Darwin read extensively in other fields, and he says that although Darwin was this biologist, it was when he was reading about economics that the economic model that he applied to biology allowed him to come up with his, survival of the fittest, or the evolution of the species kind of idea. So, to apply a different framework into your area of expertise, and that's what it's talking about being a foxhog. That if you're just a fox or you're just a hedgehog, there are limitations to that. We even know that with teams, and with design teams especially, that they benefit from a diversity of thinking, a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of talents. Ask the big why. This is an interesting section here about, especially when you come to impasses between ideas, concepts, groups, etc., that really there's an empathic part here about understanding why people hold a philosophy or an idea or a way of thinking that they do, and that too often we assume we know the why, or we think that the why isn't as important as the what. And so we overlook this question of trying to understand why people do what they do, or make decisions the way they've made, or holding on to things. And so this is a really big thing about curiosity and finding ways to move forward, is to understand the why, to listen carefully and to try to understand where others are coming from. and making some bad assumptions. And lastly, it's to be a thinkerer. I love this, thinkerer. So thinkerer is this idea of combining thinking with tinkering. Tinkering, I can't even think of a good definition for tinkering. To mess with something, to play with something. Often a tinkerer might take something apart and then try to put it back together so they understand it well. And there's a lot of reference to Ben Franklin in here, who was not just a broad thinker, but he was a very pragmatic thinker. At different levels, from mechanics to improving the printing press to community type things like Ben Franklin started the first post office. Um, just a lot of different elements, and the idea here is it's this kind of idea that having big ideas but then playing with them and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't is a really great curious attribute and skill, and that and I'm a big believer in this. I'm a big piloter. I've always been, not always in my career, but through my career I've been a piloter, and a lot of these things speak to me. I've had a very varied career following my passion. I was trained as a programmer or as an engineer. I only programmed for a year and then wanted to do more interactive stuff, so I went into training, specifically global training, and then into strategic planning. Then I worked in nonprofit, and so I have all these like different hats that I think now give me a different perspective, especially in an academic setting, that allow me to kind of stay curious and to play with things, to play with ideas, to play with programs, to play with philosophies that I have about how people and students can be successful and what works and what doesn't, and to try them out. I've been running an intern program for 7 years with Hunt Oil in Dallas, and that program has become the model for a capstone course in the BAAS program. So this was an interesting part of a chapter. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and we're almost finished this book, sadly. Our first piece of Canvas material is an overview of quantitative data analysis. It's a nice little summary and a very high level. It should only take you a minute or two to get through this page. Some great example. And so quantitative analysis is when we're trying to figure out how do we turn our survey data or any data into kind of a numerical form. So we might be able to calculate averages, deviations, etc. And there's the image that you see here is in there, and it's a great beginning example. And then it's talking about how do we develop code categories. And this is when we're combining things into different categories, and we call that process coding with either a name or a number. And the examples in here are really simple to follow. There's 3 examples of doing that. And so it's an interesting piece. It shouldn't take you long to kind of get a sense of this quantitative, this initial part of quantitative analysis. Our next Canvas material is a discussion of univariate analysis. This looks a little complicated and there's multiple sections here, so just take your time. I think there are really good descriptions of each aspect of this. We're going to talk about uni meaning one, what frequency distributions there are, how when you're doing univariate analysis, you tend to use measures of central tendency, which is these concepts of mode, median, and mean, which we've seen before in multiple places. There's an example here, a practice example. Do the math yourself. It's just so you get a feel for doing it. It'll only take 30 seconds. It's not long. And then you can see how it's described, what dispersion is, some pictorials of the data, some descriptive statistics review, and then a concept of continuous versus discrete data. This isn't a long section, but definitely do the practice yourself, do the math yourself, and then so you get a feel for how they're displaying this. It'll help you again with the survey project. Our next Canvas slide or information pack is on bivariate analysis, bi meaning two, so we're comparing variables, more than one variable. You typically use a contingency table here, and it shows you how to construct it, gives you multiple examples and an actual practice exercise. There's some basic guidelines which aren't very, they're pretty intuitive about keeping it simple. And then the ethics around this is just making sure that you present all the data, not just summary tables as well. Our last Canvas resource for this week is a short video on mean, median, and mode. These are often confused, so this is a good exercise to go through to watch this video. You've seen this material in a number of ways, so watch the video and take some good notes.